I hope everybody's having a good time in Poli-Sci 101. This is actually a pretty difficult portion of the course where we're trying to wrestle with the ideas of Karl Marx and Max Weber. And they're not the most easy reads in the world. However, they're classics, and they are for a reason, and that is they really do shed some important insight on our world and how it works. So in this brief video lecture, I want to just briefly touch on Karl Marx and his analysis of capitalism. And I do want to point out again that his analysis is of capitalism. He hardly says anything about communism, which is kind of frustrating to a certain degree. But I hope that we can not be too distracted by that point and really focus on what he has to say about capitalism and analyze, is there something to that? So I want to review one point that's made in the written portion of your lectures and then raise another issue about alienation and what that means. So let me start with just a quick review of the structural flaws of capitalism according to Karl Marx. And he distills this into 3 points. I put it into 2 points in your written lecture, but I think I can make that into 3 points, probably even better than what I did in the writing. So point number 1 is that in a capitalist system, there's an expansionary imperative. You have to expand if you want to survive as a capitalist in a highly competitive market environment. And by expanding, that means you need to go out and find either new ways of organizing labor more efficiently or get them to work more cheaply, or you need to go out and sell your goods in a larger marketplace. And what that creates is this incredible dynamic in which capitalism essentially spreads all over the globe. Marx is writing in the 1800s, and he's already looking at the rise of globalization, which we feel a lot in, of course, our own day and age, but he describes it pretty well. I'll give you a very brief passage from the Communist Manifesto, and he writes this. The need of constantly expanding the market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. And that's pretty much what it does. If you want to survive as a capitalist, you have to be sure to make goods in the most efficient way possible. Now remember, in Das Kapital he explains that profit really is driven by your ability to exploit labor. That's the entire secret or source of how capitalists make their profit. So I hope that point's clear as you read through and as you take note of what I've explained in the lecture, what Marx tries to explain in Das Kapital. Alright, so you've got this, if you will, spread of capitalism all over the world. But what that creates is also a crisis, and it's a crisis that will continually erupt in a capitalist system. It's a dual crisis. It's a crisis both of overproduction, which I mentioned in the lecture notes, but it's also a crisis of underconsumption on the other hand. And I just want to make sure that you understand both sides of that crisis. If you're a capitalist and you want to survive, and your source of profit is essentially exploiting the labor of the proletariat class, that means that if you want to outcompete other capitalists, you got to be better essentially at exploiting people, or using new ways of organizing people, or just plain creating innovations that allow you to use machinery or technology so you don't have to rely on labor. After all, labor, they're organizing constantly, asking for time off, getting sick, and so on. So really, if you're a capitalist, you have a strong incentive to replace that, what Marx calls living labor, with dead labor, machinery. What that means, though, is you're constantly producing things. You produce too much. Even in our society today, which of course we're going through this period of economic decline, not decline necessarily, but economic sluggishness in terms of our growth. And it's not because we can't produce things, it's because there's no market for it, right? So there's a structural issue. It's kind of absurd, and Marx even describes it almost in that absurd way. Very briefly, I'm going to pause for a second and read you one brief passage here. This is actually from the manifesto, but the logic is mostly spelled out in Das Kapital. Here's what he writes, bear with me. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity. It's the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. Reflect on the crisis we've just been through. The issue is not that we can't produce things, it's we can do it too well. Now, the current crisis, as in most capitalist crises, has been initiated really by a crisis of the financial sector, but then it spreads throughout everything else. So we can produce things, that's the crisis of overproduction. But bear in mind that whole crisis is caused by this need to constantly eke out more efficiency with labor and to replace labor with either better technology, better ways of organizing, or simply replacing people with machines. Well, what that means is that you get greater unemployment and this ability to produce things. But if you have unemployment, who's going to buy all these things that are being produced? That's the underconsumption piece of this crisis of overproduction and underconsumption. All right? Now, over time, you can imagine that's going to lead, at least according to the logic of Marx, to a smaller and smaller group of the capitalist class and a larger and larger group of the proletariat as the capitalist class. Each time they go through that crisis, some aren't going to make it and they end up in the proletariat. And so eventually, point 3, right, of Marx's argument is that this system will lead to a world revolution. I don't know if that's true. I have my doubts about it. But the analysis of the problems of capitalism are pretty compelling. Not to say there's not arguments against them, but they're worth taking into account and giving some real thought to. All right, another point that I wanted to make has to do with Marx's understanding about human nature. And I do want to point out that a lot of social scientists and political scientists have these built-in assumptions about what makes us human, what drives us as humans. For Marx, what drives us is our ability to labor and to do it creatively. And if we were just free to labor, we would spend our time producing things really just as a matter of who we are as human beings. We, in a perfect condition of freedom, would labor and do so in a creative way. But capitalism doesn't allow that to happen. Instead, capitalism creates alienation, and it does so in 3 ways. It alienates the worker from what he or she has produced, it alienates us in the way things are produced, and it alienates us from each other. So those 3 key points, right? Again, we're alienated from what we produce. After all, we put in labor, if you remember the proletariat, you put in your labor, your hard effort to make something, and you don't own it. All you're doing is selling your time, right? And the capitalist owns whatever it is you produce. It's like taken from you. And so that, whatever production that you're responsible for is not yours. And you're, in a sense, divorced from the thing that you've created. In addition to that, we're alienated in just the way things are produced. In an industrial system, we don't get to labor creatively, right? We're essentially part of either an assembly line or some production process that's highly regulated, pretty rigid, and so there's not a lot of ability to be creative and free in terms of how you produce things. Marx states this again in a passage from the Communist Manifesto. He writes, "Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it's only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him." Right? So we really do have this sense that we're not connected closely to what we produce and how we produce it. Bear in mind, even in our society, which is actually moving towards a more service-oriented production rather than industrial production based on manufacturing, there's still that lack of freedom and creativity in terms of how you go about your production. In fact, most of us get stuck in cubicles and told what to do and push paper and so on, rather than putting bolts on machinery. But nonetheless, there is that sense of very regulated and regimented work. The last piece is, in terms of that alienation from our human nature of being free and creative in our labor, is that we're alienated from one another. Very famous passage from the Communist Manifesto speaks to this issue. I'm going to read it to you and hope, again, that you kind of bear with me as I read through this passage. Here's what he writes. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchic, idyllic relations. So remember there, right? He's rejecting the idea that capitalism is, or he's rejecting the idea that feudalism, is really a part of what it means to be human, because feudalism really is just these old traditional relationships. So he doesn't want that, but neither does he want capitalism, which really speaks to a different set of values, which we're going to get to this right now. So he goes on. It is pitilessly torn asunder. Capitalism is pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left no other nexus between people than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. Right? The only way we relate to one another is in this highly impersonal way, where, yeah, if I want to ride to the airport, what are you going to pay me, kind of thing, right? I got to hire a cab, and what happens to us as human beings and our emotional connections to one another. So just want you to pay attention to that in a capitalist system, and of course in Marx's analysis of it. All right. If you have any questions, feel free, give me a holler. Always eager to help explain some of these concepts. All right. Have a good week.